Good morning, all. Okay, welcome back. First of all, apologies about the textbook stuff. This is kind of the price you pay sometimes when you have free resources, so I'll be more thoughtful about putting out PDFs. I hope the 100 helps. Should bump everybody's score up a little bit and give you plenty of time to work on your other stuff. And I'll put out all 8 lectures from part 7, which will be about implementation, and part 8, which will be about evaluation. All right, let's jump in. Chapter 25. This is all the next 4 sections or lectures will be about the implementation process. So, chapter 25 is about bureaucracy and the policy process by Ora Buturin. And we'll just jump straight into section 25.2. Basically, what we should know all functioning states, at least, have a bureaucracy, right? If you don't have a bureaucracy, your state is probably not functional. You probably live in, I don't know, incredibly developing country or a country filled with civil war or these sorts of things, right? So think, I don't know, Sudan, um, Central African Republic. I mean, they have sort of proto bureaucracies, but they don't have charge of anything, right? All right. We have 2 real prisms through which we can sort of look at what is a bureaucracy and how do we study it. The first is just the form of the organization, right? This is an institution. What are the rules? What are the resources? What are the goals? What are the structures of the institution? What are the pathways and I don't know, the veto players, all of these sorts of things. Number 2, the administrative machinery as part of government, right? So from this conceptual perspective, the primary function is the execution of the will of the state, right? To implement public policies. So a little bit different way to look at what the bureaucracy is, right? Albro from 1970 offers 7 basic sub-definitions, right? So you have 2 definitions of form. You have the rational organization and just the organization as itself, right? And then you have 5 function sub-definitions, including organizational efficiency, rule by officials, public administration, administration by officials. Oh, I'm sorry. And then there was one more form. It's modern society. So 3 form, rational organization. What is the organization itself? Modern society. Okay. 25.3, the bureaucracy as an organizational form. So we're going to really tie into Max Weber's works about the bureaucracy at the turn of the 20th century. He says, excuse me, um, the legal rational type of sort of the bureaucracy can be broken down into 5 subcomponents. You've got hierarchical division, documentation, office management, full working capacity of all officials is expected, and then you have office rules, right? And this breakdown, this Weberian breakdown of the sort of subtypes or the ideal type also finds its way into all kinds of other organizations, right? From grocery stores and corporations to public non-governmental organizations and their hierarchical setup, etc., NGOs, all kinds of stuff, right? And so this is not only sort of touching on governance bureaucracy, but Weber touches on bureaucracy as I don't know, a Western type that has sort of spread around the world, right? What are the alternatives to this Western Weberian bureaucratic type, right? You have personalism, uh, living under a dictatorship, right? A tyranny, something like that. Think Papa Dr. Valier or something, right? You have charismatic leadership. So this is a little bit tied to personalism, but we're seeing this rise across the world. If you took the last class that I gave about political philosophy, We learned in one of the pieces that um, competitive authoritarianism is on the rise, but so is learning about how to manage a dictatorship. So dictatorships don't look like they used to, and a lot of them tend to run on this sort of personalism or charismatic leadership. The final is primogeniture, and this is what we used across the planet, especially in sort of the European scene from, I don't know, all of history until maybe the Enlightenment period or the democratization of states. Primogeniture just means firstborn, right? And so this is where um, leadership and power is turned over to the firstborn son, right? Generally, the firstborn son, primogeniture. And this still happens in a few places across the planet, like Bhutan, um, North Korea. Arguably, it didn't go to the firstborn son this last time, but it still went through the family line. And in fact, Kim Jong Un murdered his own brother in an airport in Malaysia just to ensure that the line stayed intact and that there was no sort of competition for the North Korean godhood, I guess, right? So yeah, he murdered his own brother in an airport. He had two girls approach him and pretend to be like a prank TV show and killed him with poison. So yeah, my my little note here is that I promise bureaucracy is an improvement over personalism, tyranny, and primogeniture, right? Merit and bureaucratic governance can be an improvement. It's not perfect, right? But there's worse out there. Okay, section 25.3, the bureaucracy is part of the government. All right, so here we're just sort of talking about how the bureaucrats sort of put out the laws that are created by the House or whatever it might be, right? So they say here that bureaucracy is made of public officials who are appointed through recruitment processes and not elected. So these are not elected officials. There is a distinction to be made there, right? And there are questions that come up because of that, like accountability and all of these sorts of things. How well are they actually implementing what was supposed to be implemented in theory? These sorts of things. There are also questions about which parts of the government do we include. Some scholars think that we should be including things like the military and the judiciary. Others say no, these don't function the same way as sort of I pass a law, the bureaucrats go and implement the law on the ground. Well, that's not exactly what the military and the judiciary do. So this is sort of up in the air, right? It sort of depends on your personal take, I guess. I wanted to point out the just sort of extraordinary complications of the bureaucracy in the United States system. So you've got multiple levels because of checks and balances and federalism. You've got the federal government, you've got the state governments, you've got the local governments, including your city and your locale, your school boards, your county, your parish, if you're in Louisiana, whatever it might be. You have just a very small spattering of regional governance systems like the Colorado River Basin. You've got cooperation between the states and the Fed, the locals and the Fed, the locals and the state, the locals and the states and the Fed, right? I mean, there's a lot going on here when it comes to the American bureaucracy. Internally, you've got other bureaucracies, right? So you have like a bureaucracy will have an internal bureaucracy, right? So like meta levels, and these include things like human resources, right? And also the auditing people, right, to make sure that budgets are being spent correctly, that rules are being followed, all of these sorts of things. Many of the positions of the auditor have been fired under the Trump administration, so it seems like no one's really looking anymore, and sort of holding each of these bureaucratic entities to account and checking their books and all of these things, which can be a little bit troubling, right? There are reasons that these auditing systems were put into these bureaucracies, and it is to help the American public ensure that accountability is happening, right? And that money is being spent correctly and that rules are being followed, etc., right? So just stripping all of the auditors out of the American bureaucratic system, uh, while we were told that this is a good thing, it probably is not. It probably is not. It means no one's watching, right? No one's monitoring. Okay, there's a debate around the will of the state and the execution of the will of the state, right? So, again, in ideal theoretical senses, the Congress under Article 1 is supposed to pass a bill. Then it gets sort of passed on down to the bureaucrats where it is refined, right? And rules are built around the law. Those rules later, once they are established, become law. They have the power of law under the Chevron ruling from the Supreme Court. Um, but how well the will of the elected officials is actually carried out in practice is difficult and lies on a spectrum from terribly and um, maybe even in conflict with the will of the policymakers, right? To perfectly implemented whatever, right? There's a spectrum. Too strong a democracy can be a problem. I mean, too strong a bureaucracy can be a problem, right? It removes it removes checks and balances. It removes citizen accountability. They're not elected. We've talked about all these sorts of things before. But too weak a bureaucracy can degrade a state, right? As you degrade a bureaucracy, you're also degrading all the services you provide to citizens. Many of those services, which actually boost the economy through, I don't know, entrepreneurship, through spending on the demand side, the Keynesian sort of side of economics, especially for the very poor, all of these sorts of things, right? And so we need to find a nice balance where we have some accountability and some effectiveness, but not so much effectiveness that it turns into tyranny, right? Okay. Section 25.4, the role of the bureaucracy in the policy process. So, in this sense, instead of just being an intermediary for the will of the public, the will of the policymakers, um, under this conceptualization of bureaucracy, the bureaucrats are actually making policy, right? And so they point out really that, look, the five stages model that we've hammered on in this whole book is a model, right? And in reality, all of this stuff is going on simultaneously. There's feedback loops, there's all kinds of stuff happening, right? And so the bureaucracy can be very powerful in determining what those laws actually look like when they're implemented, in determining the nitty gritty rules around laws like environmental laws, et cetera. And so the bureaucracy, in many ways, is involved in a lot of the different stages from the five-stage model that we've talked about, where they are involved in agenda setting, right? They're involved in determining the limited solution set and providing expertise and testimony, appraisal data and testimony, all of these sorts of things. And then finally, in the implementation stage, really the only stage that they're not sort of highly involved in is the writing of the policy, right? Like the actual passing of the policy itself. Policymakers, remember, I think we've touched on this plenty of times too, they're lawyers. They don't really understand the nitty gritty technical differences, the scientific needs, all of these sorts of things, the basic sort of chemistry that might be behind, say, environmental or agricultural policy, all of these things, right? And so, as we've talked about before, the policymakers will sort of, I don't know, write a vague sort of hopeful law, right, to show the public that they're doing something. And then they'll just hand it over to the bureaucrats, and they will take quite a while, often months or a year or whatever it might be, to build the rules around these goals that have been set by policymakers, right? And they'll put in the scientific and the technical and the chemistry and all of these sorts of things, right? And so this gives bureaucrats a lot of time, not time, but a lot of sort of wiggle room for determining what the actual outcomes of the policy are going to be. It's also important to point out that bureaucrats tend to be very long term, right? Most bureaucrats are sort of sitting on a 20 to 30-year career. They are lifers, and at least prior in our in our history, politicians didn't last as long, right? Now, political seats are becoming more and more extended over time because of gerrymandering, right? We all know what the problem is. Um, but this gives I don't know, it causes tensions between the lifers in the bureaucracy and the policymakers who are just trying to sort of keep their head afloat and get reelected, right? And so there are I guess questions and philosophies to be teased out because of this different setup. All right. Section 25.4.1, bureaucrats as policymakers. We've been touching on, the bureaucracy often can actually write or refine policy and how it's implemented in real life. Japan is a fascinating case here, right? Japan, post World War II, their bureaucrats have been more powerful than their political leaders, right? And Japan has a prime ministerial setup with a two-house system, but mostly just a diet, like the House of Representatives, as we would think of it, or the Parliament, or whatever. Mostly the diet is in charge; they write the rules. But really, what we've learned from deep case studies and things like that is that Japan's bureaucracy runs the show, and they have for a long time. And it worked well post World War II, all the way up until around the 1980s when we saw currency problems, what was called the lost generation, um, stagnant wages, all of these sorts of things, right? And so they've been sort of in stasis for about 50 years, and there's been very little, I don't know, very little action on getting them out of that stasis, right? Okay. Know also that the power of bureaucracies is on a spectrum from weak to strong. Um, States will generally pick core missions and make those their stronger bureaucratic entities, right? So in South Korea, this was education and training. Um, it was business and export models, right? So their ports and things of that sort. In the United States, the focus tends to be much more on like energy or espionage or military, etc. Most countries have a very powerful national health bureaucracy, but America is not in the single payer system set, and so we don't really have that, right? And then finally, I would point out this iron triangle problem that most of you have probably heard of. This is the idea that eventually the politicians or the policymakers come together with the bureaucrats, who come together with the lobbyists and the industry members, and they create this iron triangle, right, where they sort of disconnect electoral accountability and sort of, how would I put this? I don't know. They work together to ensure their own sort of policy paradigm, right? A little bit of collusion, I guess, is what I would call it, between politicians, bureaucrats, and lobbyists. And when this happens, the accountability from the electoral system disappears, right? And we've got to break up this iron triangle to reconnect accountability. And this seems to be a rising problem in the United States, right? Especially because of the Citizens United, and the money flooding into our systems, our freewheeling lobbying system, which can be very troubling at times. Um, And it seems like this iron triangle is being strengthened over time rather than weakened. All right. Section 25.4.2, bureaucrats as policy implementers. Again, bureaucrats tighten the rules, right? We'll write a vague law, the bureaucrats will tighten the rules. This often, though, means that we'll have different rules for different regions. And so this is actually one of the reasons that sometimes policymakers don't make things as explicit or technical as possible, right? Because they don't have the time to write a separate policy for every region in the country, right? Or every state in the country, right? Because each state and region is idiosyncratic in some senses. And just having a sort of America wide policy um, can be detrimental, right? It can help some regions and hurt others, right? And so, for this reason, sometimes the flexibility that the bureaucracy has to, I don't know, tack on little nitty gritty rules around an overarching policy goal can be helpful, right? Because we can approach Texas differently from California, differently from Ohio, and differently from Maine, right? Very different contexts, different ideologies, different transportation networks, different weather. I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? And so sometimes you need a little bit of wiggle room. We often get a feedback loop for annual adjustments, right? We sort of went through that in the project for paper 3, where we get the appraisal system and all these congressional meetings. Some of those meetings are on the annual schedule, right? And often these bureaucrats or the bureaucracies themselves have to do annual reviews of their policies and make, tinkering around the margins. Finally, there exists some leeway at the street level, right? So think about a cop. Um, let's say marijuana policy. Marijuana is illegal in most states, including Texas, right? There are nuances here, but it is still quote unquote illegal by the federal government. The federal government just put marijuana into tier 3 in their drug classification, but that's only for legal medicinal marijuana, right? And so if you don't have legal medicinal marijuana or whatever, and you're just walking around Texas smoking a joint on the street in San Antonio or something, and a cop stops you, in many senses, yes, it is illegal, but sometimes they don't enforce, right? And so we see a lot of this where they won't enforce the laws at the ground level, right? And it might be like your city captain says, hey, we've got more important shit to deal with. Let's not do this, right? That's kind of the approach that Austin, Texas has taken. And then sometimes you just have individual officers who have their own thoughts about, look, it's a joint. Like, step on it and go home and stop doing this in the future, kind of thing, right? Where the individual officer has their own agency in deciding how they want to enforce or whatever. All right, finally, bureaucracy and governance, section 25.4.3. The Reagan Thatcher movement, which we'll talk about in some of the future chapters. The Reagan Thatcher movement in the 80s brought this mass downsizing to the bureaucracies. It privatized many government services and functions. It brought in what's called the new public management movement, which we'll discuss in the next chapter. And we seem to be in a sort of history repeats itself mode, right? Where the Trump administration is trying to do the exact same thing. They brought in Elon high on mushrooms to do Doge. Like that's a true story. Um, Ketamine and mushrooms and all kinds of like psychedelics, etc. I don't know why that dude was in our government when he's high as a kite, but whatever. Um, we seem to be in this history repeats itself moment where bureaucrats again have become like the villain and we're going to cut down on them and save the government a bunch of money, but I mean that's not real. We didn't save a bunch of money, we just killed a bunch of jobs. In fact, the federal government only has about 3 million employees, right, across the entire country, while state and local governments have about 20 million employees, right? And so it's very, I don't know, manipulated about like our federal bureaucracy being bloated. In many ways, that's bullshit, right? Texas's bureaucracy is bloated. Our local governments are bloated. And nobody ever talks about those, right? All right, that's all I got for you for today. I'll get the next one up quickly. Thanks for being here and have a great day.